Good morning. Open up your Bibles, if you would, to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Okay, so we know chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians can be a difficult chapter to work through. It's a highly debated, controversial at times chapter across the world. I think it's easy to misapprehend the Paul statements. Sometimes people will take it out of context. They look at just one verse, and they don't look at the whole of what he's dealing with, what he's talking about. And there is an emotional element naturally attached to the subject of divorce and remarriage, and I think that's just due to the fact that no one wants to see a relative, nobody wants to see a friend in a situation that could cause them, their relationship with God to be strained. So, as we work through this chapter, I want us to keep things in context. I want us to look at it logically and rationally. If you have a comment or question, I encourage that, but please think through it. If it's a situation that you're in, you know someone else is in, it might be best to not bring that up in class. It's always best to do that one-on-one with myself or maybe with the elders. A class setting may not be the place to do it. Careful with asking questions that have to do with situational ethics. Let's not go there with it. Let's just look at the text. Let's discuss it. Let's figure out what Paul's point is and how he develops it. This is how I'm going to break down the chapter. We're going to look at verses 1 through 7 this morning. Verse 1 is where he deals with the issue at hand. Oh, I thought you were talking about mine. Did you start the stream? Okay. The issue at hand, verses 2 through 7 is his immediate response. Next week, we'll look at verses 8 through 16, where you have the instructions to the unmarried. That's also the widows there as well. Then instructions to the married. Instructions to Christians married to unbelievers. And then the last part will be our third lesson, 17 to 40, where he talks about first remaining in that condition in which you are called. Probably one of the most taken out of context, misconstrued verses in the Bible when he brings that up. Advice to the unmarried and advice to widows. Now, verses 1 through 7, that's the shortest section we're going to look at today. But it's important that we understand this section the most. This sets the stage for what he's going to talk about. If we understand verse 1 and his immediate response, we'll better understand what he's talking about throughout the rest of the chapter. Everything else in this chapter is going back to deal with what he says in verse 1. Not everyone believes that, but the context points to that. He is dealing with this situation. When we work through this, he's not talking about divorce and remarriage, although divorce is a theme, but there is no remarriage. This is a chapter about people who want to get out of their marriages. They don't want to get in marriage. So I'm going to be approaching the text in this way. And before we jump into the text, a little background as a reminder to us. The church in Corinth, we know they're troubled. They got a lot of doctrinal errors that led to several sinful practices. Paul learned of many of these, if not everything, from Chloe's people. Remember that from chapter 1, verse 11. He also talks about some others in chapter 16 that brought some information to him. Also, he wrote that first letter he talks about in chapter 5, verse 9, that letter about immorality that they misinterpreted and didn't apply correctly, which could be why he makes certain statements he does. We'll look at one of those today in verses 1 through 7. But Paul, he's going to visit them more. He'll write some more letters to them. He discusses a number of issues in the first 6 chapters. But here in chapter 7, verse 1, there's a change of topic when he says, now concerning the things about which you wrote. I don't know if they wrote him a series of questions or they wrote him a series of topics, and he's going to deal with those topics, but he's definitely moving to do that here. And so the first issue there in verse 1, so now concerning the things about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. This is what he's going to deal with in chapter 7. Now, what does he mean? The idea of touching a woman must, in this context, refer to sexual relationships. The expression in the Greek occurs widely all throughout literature, not just in the Bible, but all throughout literature there, to mean that same thing. It's a euphemism for having sexual intimacy when it says that. So this is an issue presented by the church that Paul's addressing. It is concerned with whether or not it is a good thing spiritually to not engage in sexual relationships of marriage. Again, Paul's theme is not divorce and remarriage. There's elements of that, but that's not what his focus is on. Some in Corinth have gotten this idea that they would be more spiritual if they did not engage in these sexual relations with their mates. So their question to Paul could be something like this. Wouldn't it be better, Paul, if we were not married and we didn't engage in those sexual activities of the flesh? To which Paul is going to answer, yes, I am in agreement. It would certainly be good for a man not to touch a woman. That's what he's answering, I think. So I think it's a passage about living the celibate life. Well, I shouldn't say I think. It is a passage about living the celibate life. So the church in Corinth, they're wanting out of their marriages in order to live before God in a celibate way. Another element in the church was just the opposite, right? We've been looking at some of those things. There's a lot of sexual promiscuity through immorality with prostitutes, chapter 6. The brother who had his father's wife over there in chapter 5. The way they used to live before they became Christians. In fact, there was a word in that day and age that all of Rome and Empire used was to Corinthianize. Have you heard that ever brought up? That was a term they used back then to indicate a person was immoral. It was to Corinthianize. It's because of the way people lived in Corinth. It was very bad. They had a lot of sexual promiscuity. It was bad in that city. So imagine coming to Christ, going to church in the city of Corinth, surrounded by that everywhere, and then while you're there in the church, you see that there is somebody who is with his father's wife. And then some of the so-called brothers and sisters are going to these temple prostitutes and other places. What are they doing? So you got that one extreme, and then others who are thinking, I want to be more spiritual. I want to be more like Paul. You know what? Paul was not married. He was celibate. I'm going to be the same way. I think that's the right thing to do. I know I'm married, but clearly that is not a good thing to do. Look at the way the world looks at that, so I don't want to engage in that anymore. I want to be more spiritual. And so they don't want to do the things they're supposed to be doing with their wife or their spouse, or they want to get out of those marriages. So some people adopt this view. Now, historically, for us, do we have people who try to do the same thing? They want to live the celibate life. Yeah, you got nuns, monks. They try to do this. They consider anything fleshly and in their way of thinking to be contrary to a spiritual life, so they want to put it away. But you see these, I think, in Corinth, they're trying to do the same thing. They're trying to fix that. So to this, Paul gives his immediate response in verses 2 through 7. So it is good for a man not to touch a woman, verse 2. But because of immoralities, each man is to have his own wife, and each woman is to have her own husband. The husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise also, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Stop depriving one another, except by agreement for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But this I say by way of concession, not of command. Yet I wish that all men were even as I myself am. However, each man has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. So, Paul agrees with the basic premise of the inquiry. It is good for a man not to touch a woman. When he said, Paul, we know he was not married, so he could speak from experience in answering this. So he says, yeah, sure, I agree. But verse 2 gives us a little not exception, but a clause there. Because of immoralities. What is that? That suggests that Paul recognizes that there is a need for sexual fulfillment, and it's a strong temptation. Someone might boast that they could live a celibate life, but then they fall prey the fact that they can't do it. They think they could. They probably have it in their mind, hey, I'm going to be more spiritual if I do this, but then they fall prey to temptations. Paul's worried about this. We're not all as strong or as disciplined as we may think we are. So while it is good to live celibate or not to engage in sexual gratification through marriage, we need to consider the dangers of giving in to a strong desire and actually defeat our purpose of wanting to be more religious or wanting to be more spiritual, which is a struggle that they will go through. So it is right and good for Christians to marry and enjoy the privileges of that. Those without the strength, though, to resist temptation, each might need to have their own wife, or each might need to have their own husband. We're in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 through 7. So Paul is not agreeing with the Corinthians who suggest that to live a celibate life guarantees that one's going to be more spiritual. He's not in agreement with that. Okay? But he does see that, it is good to not touch a woman if you're able. We'll get more into that in just a moment. I know that the Catholic Church requires all its priests to not be married. Did you know that? If you're going to be a priest in the Catholic Church, you're not allowed to be married. How well has that gone over for them? Horribly. Horribly. And they struggle with that because not everyone can do that. Only a very few are able to. So we should pause here and say again that the issue in Corinth is not divorce and remarriage. Divorce is the main theme, is a dominant theme involved here. Remarriage is not. And these are not people wanting to get into marriages. These are people who want to get out of their marriages. So if we would keep, I think, this issue in mind, I think it will help us unravel a lot of the difficulties that we may run into all throughout chapter 7. It is a difficult chapter. A lot of people misconstrue it. They take it out of context. They want to say certain things that it does not say. And I'll be honest with you, I wish I could agree with a lot of people out there, some of the things they teach about marriage, remarriage, or divorce and remarriage. I wish I could. But I don't see it in the gospel. I don't see it in the scripture. I think it's pretty clear what it says over in Matthew 19 and here. We'll dive in some of those things as we work through the text, but we're just going to look at verses 1 through 7, which is the premise for chapter 7, what Paul wants to get across to these folks. Now, verses 3 through 5. Here, Paul is specifically instructing those Christians who desire to be out of their marriages and who now wish to refrain from sexual contact. Remember, they think it's going to be more spiritual if they do that. So they likely have associated even their marital intimacy with giving in to fleshly desires. And so they consider it to be a hindrance to their prayer life, to piety, whatever it might be. But they see that. And really, you almost can't blame them with everything they're seeing going on within the church and everything there at Corinth, and everything they see happening in their city. They probably think this is not a good thing to engage in. So they're a little worried about that, and they want to get out of it. But because they're married, Paul tells them they have certain obligations there at verse 3. Let the husband fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. Now the Greek here can literally be translated as, the husband must continue to fulfill an obligation to his wife. And that's in contrast to verse 5 where it says, stop depriving one another. One of the reasons for marriage involves sexual gratification. When two people marry, they have certain expectations, and that's one of them regarding intimacy. So there's obligations placed upon both the husband and upon the wife. If marriage is the place where God has ordained this to be, and then two people who get married must expect those things to occur as part of the privilege of being married. So it would be wrong for either the husband or the wife to suddenly choose to be celibate, because if you choose that, you're forcing your mate to choose it as well. But you can't do that. We don't have the right, we don't have the authority to do that. They simply don't have that. So being a husband or being a wife places certain obligations upon us based on the usual expectations of marriage. So those Corinthians who are now deciding that they could be better Christians by abstaining from these things in marriage are wrong in that. Whether it's a topic or a direct question that they are giving to Paul, he's answering it right here. Yeah, it is good not to touch a woman, but if you're married, no, you can't do that. You can't make that choice. You can't make that decision in that way. He goes on in verse 4. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. And this is why it would be wrong for some of the married Corinthians to suddenly decide, I want to be celibate now. I think that's wrong. Can't do that. A husband's or a wife's decision of celibacy affects the other. And since each came into the marriage with those particular expectations of intimacy, Paul says we're under obligation to fulfill those responsibilities in those matters. But note that Paul is not saying here that the husband may demand whatever he wants of his wife and vice versa. It's only dealing with the aspect of sexual intimacy because of a decision to become celibate. That's what he's dealing with. Again, I bring that up because it amazes me what we find in commentaries or whatnot. We got to keep it in context. What is he dealing with? Celibacy. That's what he's dealing with. Once a person's married in the normal sense of circumstances, we're not talking about eunuchs here, then he or she does not have the authority to dictate how they will use their body in choosing to use it or not in those gratifications. If we leave the expression in their context, I think we'll understand what Paul is to say when he says it's good for a man not to touch a woman, that they have no right to suddenly choose to become celibate, even if the reasons for being are spiritually motivated. We made a choice when we got married. Become one flesh. It's no longer mine, it belongs to Jenny. No longer Jenny's, it belongs to me, but we're one. And that's what Paul's talking about. You can't make those kinds of decisions. However, he's going to give an exception here in just a moment in verse 5 when Paul gives the first apostolic command on this, when he says, stop depriving one another. Now, when you see that, what does that tell you? They're already doing this. They've already started. So he's telling you, you need to stop that. Stop depriving one another, except, so there's the clause, by agreement for a time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come together again, lest Satan tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So, again, the imperative, stop depriving, implies that they're already practicing. That's unacceptable. But he goes on to say that if both parties in this marriage have the same mindset, then a period of celibacy is permissible. That word agreement there, it's only found here in our New Testament, and it means mutual agreement, requiring the consent of both parties. The husband can't do it on his own. The wife can't do it on her own. They have to agree. And Paul concedes this possibility only for a time. And that phrase, for a time, it doesn't mean for whatever time you choose. It is a Greek phrase that means for a short period of time. A short period, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Now, what does that mean? You may devote yourselves to prayer. We may be thinking in our minds, well, it's obvious, so that they can devote themselves to prayer, Chris. But there's more to it happening in the Greek than just that. I want to give you a few other translations that people have put out there, commentators. One says, you could translate this as, that you may find unhurried time for prayer. Linsky, I like Linsky, but I don't fully agree with him on here. He says, for a term that you have leisure for prayer. Another fella has that you may have undisturbed leisure for prayer. But I like Vincent's word studies where he says, may give yourselves over to prayer and devotion. The purpose, he says, Paul gives here is the very purpose that these few Corinthians were seeking in celibacy. They wanted to devote themselves to spiritual things. So they want to kind of devote themselves and put their mind and heart focused on those things for a time. They wanted it for a long time. Paul says for a short time, you can put your focus on here at these times. So their view of sexual intimacy may have been misconstrued, probably because of the circumstances happening there in Corinth, pretty bad. But it was misconstrued to the extent that they saw an inconsistency with engaging in fleshly desire one moment, and then the next moment, kneeling in prayer. It bothered them in their conscience to do that, I think. But they didn't have authority to change that circumstance they were already in, that is, marriage. They couldn't do that. But Paul concedes that it would be acceptable on a temporary basis, and if by agreement by both parties, to be celibate for a little bit, a short time, to devote yourselves fully to pursuing the desires of spiritual development in specific areas of concern. I think that's all Paul's saying with that phrase. Nothing more and nothing less. I've been talking a lot. Any comments, any questions on those first few verses and sections? Please feel free to ask them now, because I really believe verses 1 through 7, if we get this down in our minds, it will help us throughout the rest of the chapter, which can be difficult. There will be difficult passages for us to overcome and look at and dive into. I want to make sure we know and understand why Paul is writing this section that he's writing. It's important. Context matters. So Paul, again, he goes on to say, come together again. That's talking about the intimacy, lest Satan tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So, again, assumes the strength of our sexual desire of humans. We may find it difficult to remain faithful to a spouse during periods of prolonged abstinence, and it also assumes that Satan is always looking for opportunities. And if he knows that you are going to be weak in a certain area, he may find that as an opportunity to come after us and cause us to violate the will of God. So Paul urges vigilance on our part not to allow Satan opportunity. Again, this means that one individual in a marriage cannot suddenly determine that they are just going to live a celibate life from then on. Can't do that. So if both agree, they can practice abstinence for a brief, short period of time, but they must not allow time to be too long in order for that temptation to get strong, fulfilling or giving Satan the opportunity. All right, verse 6. There's more debate on this one too. Paul says, but this I say by way of concession, not of command. So what's the this? And some people think it's talking about verses 2 through 5. Some thinks it's talking only about verse 2. Some thinks it's talking about some things later on. I always like to look at the antecedent. The antecedent is whatever going back to see what he was talking about. So verse 6, what's the this? I think the this has to do with what the previous verse there in verse 5, he's referring to this idea of making an agreement to separate sexually on a temporary basis. He says it's not a command. He says it's a concession. And since there was an imperative before the concession, the imperative being stop depriving one another, then the concession was you can come together and an agreement for a short period. You can have abstinence. But someone might have thought that the permission to separate sexually should be construed as a command. Now, Paul may be doing this and specifying this because remember his first letter, which he talked about in chapter 5, that they misunderstood and misconstrued was about immorality. Since they misconstrued that, I think he's trying to make sure they understand exactly what he's saying here. I am not saying this is a command. This is by concession only. You both have to agree. It's got to be a short time, but not everyone has to do this. So you can't force a spouse into it if you think it's something that's absolutely necessary. So, does that make sense there in verse 6? Okay. Now, it is possible that some in Corinth had used Paul as an example of someone who lived a celibate life. I brought that up already a little bit. So they may have stated that since Paul was celibate and he was spiritually mature, the two were related. Does that make sense if you really think about it? Yeah, it would. I could see somebody coming to that kind of conclusion if you were in the Corinthian congregation and you saw everything happening and you thought, man, when Paul was here, he wasn't married. He lived a celibate life. Look at all the fleshly desire people are diving themselves into. I don't want anything to do with that. I want to be spiritual like Paul. And Paul was not married. So we're not married anymore. And that they're thinking that that's okay. But no, can't do that. So Paul is dealing with this. So they might have used Paul to substantiate their celibate life. So it may have prompted Paul to talk about himself here in verse 7, where he says, "Yet I wish that all men were even as I myself am. However, each man has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that." So Paul would want everyone to be like him, but he does not require it of everyone. Now, I remember when I first was taught this in a school setting, I was told Paul's talking about the celibate life. Do you think Paul is saying, I wish everyone could be like me and could be unmarried and live a celibate life? Does that make sense? That goes against what God designed us to be, male and female. That cannot be it. So what could he be talking about? I already know, but I was saying maybe you could see it. He's talking about the gift of self-control. Don't you wish you had that kind of self-control? When I look in our society, boy, I wish all men had that self-control. Look at what's going on in our country. We're starting to look like Corinth. I wish everyone had the self-control Paul had when it came to sexual desires. He can live the celibate life because he doesn't worry about it. I cannot live the celibate life. I remember when I started looking for a wife. Needed to find a wife. Can't do it. But there are some things I have self-control on that doesn't bother me one bit. I have no desire to take drugs or drink alcohol at all. No desire for it. I remember when I was in my 20s, everyone in the house was smoking. And I thought, well, I'll try it. I wasn't a Christian. I just thought, I'll give it a try. I did it for about 3 weeks. I thought, what a waste of money. Every time I went to buy a pack, I thought, why am I doing this? This is stupid. This is dumb. So I was like, that makes no sense. Why do I do that? I have no desire. I don't get addicted to those things. I do get addicted to some things, like deviled eggs. I have no control over deviled eggs. But we all have different desires. We all have self-control in this area, but not in that area. Paul wishes everyone could be like him and that they have that kind of self-control. Because wouldn't that alleviate all kinds of problems in society if we did? Boy, that would have alleviated about 80% of the problems in Corinth. But they're not like that. And so he has to write this chapter. He's got to deal with these problems and these issues. So he has this gift. Now, this gift he's talking about, it's not, when I was reading through, some commentator said it's the gifts of the Holy Spirit that God gave him to be this way. No, it's not supernatural. These are the talents, these are the gifts that we're all given different types, different portions in some way. It's not supernatural, it's just gifts that we have. That's all he's saying about. And these may be developed and strengthened, these can be ignored, they can be weakened. We are not all made alike, and certainly if we're weak in an area of sexual control, it would be better for us to marry than to engage in immorality in a moment of weakness. Paul's not concerned that he would succumb to these temptations in that area. So it would be good if everyone was like him in having the ability of having sexual self-control. He's Not saying for everyone not to be married, but that they would be able to observe abstinence by agreement if married, and that they would not give in to any temptation involving immorality. So this first pericope, this first paragraph, verses 1 through 7, it sets the stage for what is being discussed in chapter 7. We'll see the theme of divorce. It's not remarriage after divorce. He's not dealing with that. Even though so many go here for that, it's not what it's talking about. It is the desire to live a celibate life. That's what he's dealing with here. These are not people wanting to get into marriages. These are people who want to get out of their marriages. Paul's dealing with that. And he commends the desire to be more spiritual. That's good. But he cautions them against immorality, and he warns of strong temptations in the area of marriage obligations when they're not kept. So he allows, as we already mentioned, for a short period, a spiritual focus away from those responsibilities, but it's a concession, not a command. Both have to agree, and it has to be a short time. He warns that these must be temporary because Satan's looking for those opportunities. And then from here, he's going to go into instructions to the unmarried and widows in verses 8 through 9 when he says, "But I say to the unmarried and the widows, that it is good for them if they remain even as I. But if they do not have self-control, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion." What is he talking about? It's the celibate life. But if you don't have the self-control, then you can't do that. It's better for you to marry if you don't have that self-control. Then he goes on to the married in verses 10 and 11. "But to the married, I give instructions, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not leave her husband." Why would she want to leave her husband? Well, unless she was thinking, oh, it's good for me not to touch my husband, I should live the celibate life. That's why he brings this up. And then verse 11, "But if she does leave, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife." Why would he want to do that? Unless he was thinking in his mind, hey, it's better for me to be celibate and be more spiritual. Can't do that. We're going to dive more into that next week. Instructions to Christians married to unbelievers, and he gets into that. Well, what if the unbeliever wants to leave me because unless I go and do certain things I'm not supposed to be doing in the Christian life? Well, he said, well, then you can allow it, but you got to remain unmarried. We're going to dive more into those things. Remain in that condition in which you are called. Just skimming over these things. But what is he talking about? He's talking about those people who want to get out of the marriage. No, you can't. You remain. You're not allowed to do that. And what is the only reason that we read in our New Testament on how you can get out of a marriage? Adultery. That's it. That is it. Well, that and death. Death of a spouse. That would do it too. Advice to the unmarried. Advice to widows. And then that's it. That is it. But the chapter is dealing with celibacy. People who want to be more spiritual, but they have a skewed understanding of the fleshly and the spiritual there, and so they're mixing things up in a way that they cannot do that. And so Paul's straightening these things out. Please read over the chapter. Keep things in their context. Keep verses 1 through 7 in your mind as you read through, and as we study through, we'll keep referencing back to it. This is what he's dealing with. This is the point, and we need to keep it there. I had left time for comments and questions, but I'm not getting any. Well, I'm surprised. I'm not that I should be surprised, but.
You said for a time was used in multiple spots. What does that time usually refer to?
Okay.
I mean, time's all relative, right? So
Well,
2 months of wandering out of 40 years is pretty short.
well, in the Greek, it's the phrase is an idiom that they use in the Greek times. We find it not just in the Bible, but in other places. It's not meant for months, but a short time. It's not a specific time, but it's a short time, but not just one person agrees on it. They both have to agree. Now, what is a short time? So that you don't give Satan an opportunity. So that short time could be, well, when you feel like you need to come back together, you're talking to your wife or you're talking to your husband, then you let me know. That would be the short time. When you feel like, hey, you know what, we need to get together, then it's over. It could be that. So it's arbitrary depending on the people. So he's not giving them a specific time, but we do know it's going to be a short time. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for the question. What else? Anything?
The only thing that was going through my mind was, it just seems odd that if, like, even if, like, you had a family, and you're like, oh, I'm just gonna leave, and, like, do most of them not have, like, families or kids, and
Well,
you're just leaving, and then,
Well, I don't think these people, I mean, I don't know for certain, but my assumption is that they weren't wanting to leave the family, but they were, in essence, divorcing in the sense that they were going to live a celibate life, which would defeat the purpose of the marriage. It would create strain and stress, especially if you had an unbeliever, you were married to an unbeliever. Maybe they were wanting to separate from that. I don't know. But whatever the cause is, you're looking at a culture there in Corinth where even though things look bad in our country, it's not as bad as it was in the city of Corinth. So sexual promiscuity there was more than just rampant and open. It was pretty bad where fathers and sons would normally go down to the temple prostitutes all the time. That was a normal way of life for a lot of people there. And so I'm assuming sleeping around was a normal activity in that city as well because of the reputation the city had. So I don't know what their mindset was on leaving a family or leaving a wife or a husband. Maybe it was so common where that wasn't a big deal to them. I don't know. But I'm assuming that they were saying, I want to live a celibate life. We can't have sex anymore. But they would stay in the family element and take care of the family. But they didn't want to engage in anything that they would consider fleshly and distract them from spiritual things, which they could not do. So that's why they wrote Paul. And Paul agrees, yeah, that is good, but. And he gives the reasons for that. Good question. Anything else? All right. While we're working through this is why I've been wanting to kind of go chapter by chapter. So I come to this one. Also, when we get over to head coverings, spend a little time with these so we can know what it says. This one's short. I know, verses 1 through 7. Next week, it's got a lot more information in there. But knowing this, understanding this, will give us a better idea of what Paul's talking about in these other sections. And we need to know this because the world, especially in Christendom, misconstrue this chapter and they take it out of context. And our goal should be what? To know what the scripture says. So we need to approach it as if we've never read it before. Let's see what Paul's point is, and let's look at how Paul develops it. I'm giving you 5 extra minutes. So next week, I get 10, right? All right, because I'm going to need it. Thank you.
The scripture reading before the lesson this morning is going to be from the book of Proverbs, if you want to turn there. Proverbs chapter 3. We're going to be looking at verses 13 through 26. 13 through 26. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 13 through 26. How blessed is the man who finds wisdom, and the man who gains understanding. For her profit is better than the profit of silver, and her gain better than fine gold. She is more precious than jewels, and nothing you desire compares with her. Long life is in her right hand, and in her left hand are riches and honor. Her ways are pleasant ways, and all her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to those who take hold of her, and happy are all who hold her fast. The Lord by wisdom founded the earth, by understanding he established the heavens. By his knowledge the deeps were broken up, and the skies drip with dew. My son, let them not vanish from your sight. Keep sound wisdom and discretion, so they will be life to your soul and adornment to your neck. Then you will walk in your way securely, and your foot will not stumble. When you lie down, you will not be afraid. When you lie down, your sleep will be sweet. Do not be afraid of sudden fear, nor of the onslaught of the wicked when it comes, for the Lord will be your confidence and will keep your foot from being caught.
Good morning. Thank you, Alex, for that scripture reading. Thank you, Elaine, for songs. And we're going to be looking. Technology. It's not working here. Oh, there it goes. We're going to be looking at some prerequisites about wise living this morning. We'll be looking at several passages throughout the book of Proverbs. And you know, all of us, we've all carry a collective wisdom passed on to us by people we know, we grew up with. Maybe it's our teachers, our parents, friends, coaches, people who shaped, molded our life as we were growing up. And some of this wisdom that we have is very helpful, but some of the wisdom we may have may not be as helpful, or maybe it's wrong in some way. And I realize that some wisdom I picked up growing up is plain wrong. In a sense, one of the mottos I had growing up, especially when I was real young, was look out for number one. You know that one? Look out for number one. And that's what I did. And so, you know, we needed to look out for ourselves. It meant that in the end, each person has to look out for their own needs or their own interests. And I did that. I tried to live by that wisdom throughout my high school years, and it got me into trouble a lot of times. But when I got married, I figured out that this was pretty bad advice to have. And I soon learned that two people who live by that motto cannot sustain a long-term relationship of mutual commitment. By the time we started having kids, I realized that is an impossible way to live with that number one idea motto. Another motto people live by is, if it feels good, do it. That's a motto. Hippie movement was all about throwing off the constraints of society, rejecting social rules, living an alternative lifestyle. If it feels good, do it. And that ultimately led to a lot of marriages crumbling. What kind of wisdom did people pass on to you? Maybe from your parents, friends, family, maybe coworkers, people you know, coaches. Some of it, I'm sure, is pretty good. Maybe some of it's wrong. But part of being an adult is sorting through all that stuff and keeping the truly wise and rejecting the unwise. And so I want us to start a new series, getting wise about life. And I want us to look at God's wisdom from the book of Proverbs. And each week we're going to look at different things, different themes or subjects. We're not going to work through Proverbs, but just themes we may find in there. And so we're going to start today by look at God's wisdom for our lives in general. And we're going to find out what true wisdom is. And I want to start off by defining the word wisdom. Before we get to our prerequisites about wisdom, let's look at what is wisdom. According to the dictionary, wisdom is the ability to discern what is true or right. So our English word wisdom has both moral implications, discerning what's right, and intellectual implications, discerning what is true. The Hebrew word for wisdom is a little more colorful than our English word. The Hebrew word for wisdom is hakama, and I can't roll it quite right. I'm sure Jim could. And it usually refers to some kind of skill or ability. And so when we see that word, hakama, in the Hebrew for wisdom, it's wisdom or distinguishing wisdom from knowledge. Because a person can have a mind full of facts, yet they would lack what you would consider authentic wisdom. And often the authors of the Bible would use that word to describe people who were skilled in a trade or skilled in a craft like woodworking, metalworking. The same word would be used for people who had skills in trading or leadership or even sailing a boat. And with that kind of background, look at Proverbs 3, verses 19 and 20. This is where that hakama word is used for wisdom. Alex had already read, but just those two verses. The Lord by wisdom, that's that word right there, founded the earth. By understanding, he established the heavens. By his knowledge, the deeps were broken up and the skies drip with dew. So these two verses represent many verses that we find all throughout the book of Proverbs that describe the relationship between wisdom and God's creation, using construction-type terminology. The author of Proverbs pictures God as being like an architect, and wisdom being like a builder. So as an architect, God designs the blueprint of the universe, but then it's wisdom who actually builds off that blueprint. Now we know that God and wisdom, that's the same person, but Proverbs typically personifies wisdom for us in some way. So it's not a literal person, wisdom, but we do see book Proverbs making wisdom out to be a woman. In fact, all of chapter 8 is a poem about Lady Wisdom. We do the same thing. We personify Lady Luck. You ever heard that? Lady Luck. We do the same thing. So speaking of wisdom as a person is a literary device to call attention to it. And you can almost talk about God's wisdom as if it were a person in its own right. And since the Hebrew word for wisdom is the feminine noun, Proverbs sees it as a woman. Lady Wisdom is the one who puts God's creative blueprint for the world together. Because of this, wisdom isn't just an attribute of God, but it's also an attribute of God's creation. Because God laid the earth's foundation using wisdom, the world around us bears wisdom's imprint. So by looking at creation, we can see and understand God's wisdom if we have eyes to see it, ears to hear it. When God used his wisdom to create the world around us, wisdom put her mark on the world. Well, I think it was, I should have looked up, I think it was Albert Einstein who said that he could see the fingerprint of God on things. When you look closer and closer, you see this organization, this obvious design in creation. That's wisdom that we see there. Another way to think of it is to picture God's creation as being like a piece of wood. God's wisdom is the wood grain in that wood, the structure and the order of God's creation. And when a woodworker with a piece of wood tries to, shave off some of it or sand it down, you go with the grain, right? You don't go against the grain. That won't work. You go with the grain. When we see and we understand the creation that God made from his perspective, with his wisdom, we can live in this life a lot easier when we live along with the creation he made, the way he intended it to be. So I want to give you a definition of biblical wisdom. Wisdom in the Bible is the art of skillful living by understanding and living within the order of creation. Wisdom living is with the grain, or wisdom is living with the grain instead of against the grain, like the sandpaper and the wood. Wise living is discerning the structure and discerning the order that God built into the world, and then living our lives in harmony with that order and structure. We'll talk more about that later on, but for now, think of wisdom as life skills that come from understanding how God created the world around us. Now let's look at the term Proverbs. Proverbs is a part of the Bible's wisdom literature. We come to the question, what exactly are Proverbs? But there are actually 3 books in the Bible that belong to this category of wisdom literature. This one, and of course Job and Ecclesiastes, which look at the darker, more cynical side of wisdom. Proverbs are short, memorable sayings whose meanings are relevant to many different situations. Maybe you remember the movie Forrest Gump. Remember the Gump-isms in there? Life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. Stupid is as stupid does. Those are Proverbs. That's what those are. And when you look through our culture, we have a lot of Proverbs. Every culture has them. Look before you leap. Easy come, easy go. Is a penny saved? You know what it is, a penny earned. Live one day at a time. Those are cultural proverbs. The Bible's book of Proverbs represents the collective wisdom of ancient Israel. And because as Christians, we believe the whole Bible is inspired, breathed by God, this collective wisdom of Proverbs represents God's angle on wisdom. Most of the Proverbs come from King Solomon, a guy that was king of Israel during the Golden Reign. But Proverbs also has wise sayings from other people as well. But it's likely that the book of Proverbs started as a book to help parents instruct their kids. You heard that from Alex's scripture reading. He was talking about his son, or talking to his son. The first 9 chapters of Proverbs are a father instructing his son on how to live wisely in the world. So Proverbs was originally a parenting strategy as moms and dads tried to equip and rear up their children in the right way, centered upon God. But also, Proverbs later became a textbook in ancient Israel to prepare people to serve as leaders. In this sense, it was a textbook for equipping emerging leaders. Maybe the sons were growing up. It's now time to equip them with other life skills and help them to serve as advisors to government posts. By the time of King Solomon, there were several counselors who were known for their common sense and for their wisdom. And it's important to understand how to apply the wise sayings of Proverbs in our lives. The sayings we find in Proverbs are generalizations. They're just generalizations about what's true most of the time. They're guidelines for wise living, but we need to resist turning them into some kind of rigid, absolute promise. These are sayings that tell us what usually works in most circumstances, but the Proverbs don't work in every single circumstance. In fact, the book of Job and the book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible deals with those kinds of situations when these wise sayings don't seem to work. So we shouldn't read Proverbs as if these wise sayings are absolute promises or laws. For example, Proverbs 15:1 tells us, "A gentle answer turns away wrath." That's true most of the time, but it's a generalization. It's not always true, is it? We know it's not always true, but all things being equal, it is true in most circumstances. So it makes sense to give a gentle answer when someone's really mad. But this proverb is not a guarantee that a gentle answer is going to turn away wrath. Proverbs 10:27, "The years of the wicked will be short." That's true more often than not, but it's not true in every single case. In most cases, a lifestyle of wickedness cuts a person's lifespan short. But as Ecclesiastes observes, that's not true in every single case. When we look out on our world, we may think, but I see a lot of wicked people living long lives. Well, it's because they're the only ones left. All the other ones, they die pretty early. We don't see them because they don't make it. But there are those who do live. So it's in general. These are generalizations, observations about how life works in most cases. And it's very important that we understand that, because especially when it comes to verses about parenting and about marriage. So Proverbs are wise sayings that are relevant to many different situations. Now let's look at some of these prerequisites about living. And I want us to begin with Proverbs 1:7. So turn your Bible over a couple of pages to chapter 1. Look at verse 7. "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction." So you see the words knowledge here, wisdom, and instruction. They're all being used as synonyms to describe really the same thing. Most Bible teachers view this verse as a motto or a theme of the entire book of Proverbs. Every wise saying we find in Proverbs goes back to this foundational proverb or principle. So the first word I want us to look at in this verse is the word fear. The Hebrew word fear can have 3 meanings. It can mean terror, it can mean respect, and it can mean worship. Clearly, this is not talking about terror or dread, because that would be inconsistent with trusting God. So the meaning here is closer to respect, closer to worship. Fear of the Lord is a posture of reverent worship of God. The other word, notice here, is the word Lord, in all caps, L-O-R-D. When we encounter that, all capital letters, the English translation is Yahweh, God's personal name to Israel in the Old Testament, his special covenant name. All other designations in the Old Testament were titles for God, but Yahweh, that was his name. And that Hebrew verb, or it comes from the Hebrew verb for I am. It's, as best as scholars can figure, Yahweh means the I am, or the self-existent one. So put the word fear together with the personal name of God, and what you have is this statement that is the first principle of wisdom, is to be the worshiper of a true God. And we find this first prerequisite, that is, To live wisely, we first need to establish an authentic relationship with God. If you want to live wisely, you must have an authentic relationship with God. We often use the word God-fearing in our culture to mean something very different, I think, than what the biblical phrase means. When we say that a person is God-fearing, we usually mean that the person lives the straight and narrow. We don't necessarily mean that that person knows God personally, but he or she acknowledges God. I hear the phrase used a lot. Usually I hear them in those old Western movies, the cowboy tip his hat, and, well, that's a God-fearing fella right there, that kind of thing. I hear it all the time, but they just mean that they live the straight and narrow, but they don't really know God. They still have that independent life. That phrase, fear of Yahweh, fear of God, means more than simply acknowledging God in our lives. It refers to a special kind of relationship. And this relationship is best described as a covenant relationship, a relationship of mutual trust and commitment. In the Old Testament, this covenant relationship came through the covenant that God made with the nation of Israel. For us, it's Christ. When he came in the world, he opened the doors for all to know God through what he called the new covenant. You may remember that from Jeremiah 31, where Jeremiah said that about talking about the new covenant, that back then, you were born, and then later you were told to know God. When you came up of age, that's the Jews. They were born into a covenant relationship, but you had to grow up to a point where you had to finally come to an understanding. But it's going to become a time when God would put his word into our hearts. And no longer will you say, know the Lord, because everyone who's in a covenant relationship with God will already know the Lord. They will know. And so even the name Jesus means Yahweh is my salvation. Is to have that relationship, that authentic relationship with God. So before we can seek to live wisely, we need to know the author of all wisdom personally, know who he is. But the reality is that there are lots of Christians who are not very wise. Many people who trust Jesus lack the kind of life skills we expect from true biblical wisdom. Just becoming a Christian doesn't automatically make you wise. A covenant relationship with God is a prerequisite, but we can't stop there. It's like on Wednesday night, we have our pew packers. We always end pew packers with hear, believe, repent, confess, be baptized, and live the faithful Christian life. We want them to acquire wisdom, know God, have that relationship, and acquire that wisdom. And if you know God, if you know who he is, that means you're in his word, you'll know how to properly apply those things. Here's the second prerequisite to live wisely. We need to passionately pursue wisdom. Look over in chapter 4 of Proverbs. Chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. That's going to be page 900 in my Bible. So if your Bible looks like this, page 900, verses 7 and 8, the beginning of wisdom is acquire wisdom. And with all your acquiring, get understanding. Prize her, and she will exalt you. She will honor you if you embrace her. And this is actually part of a poem about the importance of wisdom. And notice the commands: acquire wisdom, get understanding, prize her, that wisdom, and embrace wisdom. The pursuit of wisdom is one of the most important things in life we can do. It's more important than making a lot of money, more important than all the things in this life. If we honor wisdom, like a king, wisdom will lift us up. If we embrace wisdom like a lover, wisdom will bring true satisfaction to our lives. Now, how do we do that? How do we passionately pursue this kind of wisdom? Well, we start by asking God for wisdom. James chapter 1, verse 5. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously and without reproach. And he's not saying that, all you have to do is just stand over here, pray, God, give me wisdom, and then he opens up your head, sticks it in there, closes it, you're going to go. That would be great. I wish that's the way it would work, but it doesn't. You pray, and then you seek to acquire that wisdom through the Word. You can even look out there into creation and see, man, there's got to be. If someone was wise and honest with themselves, there's no doubt in my mind you would not come to the conclusion that there must be some great creator of all things. Where did all this stuff come from? There had to be someone who had no end. That has to be God. We can also pursue wisdom by reading the Bible, getting deep into it, especially the wisdom literatures like Proverbs. For several years, I used to read a chapter of Proverbs a day with the chapter corresponding to that day and month. You ever seen one of those? It was one of those tear-off calendars, and it had the Proverbs in there to read. I went through that. And so in the first month, I'd read chapter 1. And then the second, I'd read chapter 2, and I'd work through each one, and so forth. Another way we can pursue wisdom is by developing the art of observation. Most of wise sayings in the book of Proverbs did not come by some direct revelation from God. God didn't reveal these wise sayings through dreams or visions or audible voice. Instead, God revealed these wise sayings through people's observational skills. We see that happening with Solomon throughout those first 9 chapters. It's what you might call sanctified common sense. Most often, Proverbs worked like this: a person walking along a road, and he notices a yard of a lazy person. He notices that the yard is overgrown with weeds, that the walls around the yard are broken down, it's in need of repair. And then the observer tells us, when I saw, I reflected upon it. I looked and received instruction, a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. Then your poverty will come as a robber, and your want like an armed man. Do you notice the beginning of that? That's Proverbs 24, 32 to 34. When I saw, I reflected upon it. What did he see and what did he reflect upon? Something lazy. He realized, and then he caught on to that common sense that God had given us. And he reflected that and he put it down. That's how a lot of Proverbs came in careful observation combined with reflection. Some observe the world around us, watch how people respond, and what kind of consequences come from those actions. Many times, so many times, I ask us to write our own journals or a diary and reflect upon the things you write. If you do that, you will know yourself better. You will. You'll know. And you'll observe things in your own life. It will help. So the second prerequisite is to passionately pursue wisdom. Now look at verses 18 and 19 of chapter 4. 18 and 19. But the path of the righteous is like the light of dawn that shines brighter and brighter until the full day. The way of the wicked is like darkness. They do not know over what they stumble. So the path of the righteous is a common theme we find all throughout Proverbs. It pictures life as being this journey, lots of roads that you can take. But the path of the righteous isn't righteous because of the character of the people who choose the path. The path of the righteous is righteous because it's consistent with the character of God. So walking this righteous path makes a person righteous rather than the person making the path righteous. And then verse 18 envisions this path of righteousness as starting with just a glimmer of light. Like, you're walking along and you see the sunrise early in the morning. And as you walk, the sun gets higher and higher until it's bright noon. And you got this blazing sun over you. And so the further you go down the path, the brighter it is, the more is revealed to you. In contrast to these things is the path of the wicked. It is a place of utter darkness. And like the path of righteousness, this path isn't wicked because of the kind of people who choose it. It is wicked because it's inconsistent with the righteous character of God. This is the path all of us were on at one time or another in our lives. You don't often realize the darkness of the path because it's the only path you knew. It's the only one you'd ever been on. And you wonder why you keep stumbling. You wonder why you keep failing. And you wonder why life doesn't work the way you had thought it ought to work. You're looking around and you realize something's wrong because you're trying to live with the grain of life, but it doesn't work with the creation of life. And so we struggle. It's because we're living against the grain of God's world, His creation. We've chosen the hard path, the path of wickedness. And this part of the poem about wisdom gives us the third prerequisite. To live wisely, we need to embrace an accurate moral code. Now, a moral code functions quite like a compass would. in our lives. A moral compass provides us with a direction, a sense of what's right, a sense of what's wrong, what's good, what's evil. And when we live by an accurate moral code, we live with this moral grain of creation that God has set down before us. And life works better for us. That's what what Solomon's point is for his sons in the opening of Proverbs. You live a certain way. In general, it will go well with you. Or what Paul tells children in Ephesians, listen to your parents and you will live long. Not always true, but in general, it is true. Listen to your parents. An inaccurate moral code or broken compass, we end up getting more and more lost. So how do we find the compass? Well, how do we find this accurate moral code? Good place to start, 10 Commandments. I think that's a great place to start. The 10 Commandments provide us with a basic framework for ethical absolutes in our lives. And really the 10 Commandments are kind of the bottom line ethics, you could say. The rest of the Bible fills in those gaps as far as the law and other things go, but it's showing us how to live a moral and just life before God. Now, not that we live up to that, we can't, but we are striving. It's just like with any compass. When I was in the Army, my job was a terrain analyst, so I always had the map, I had the compass, and when we were out there in the field and we're following it along, every once in a while I had to pull out the map, put out the compass, and readjust our path. We were straying a little this way. Oh, no, got to get back. Straying a little that way, and we got to get back. That's why we get together. We read and study the Word to keep our lives in line with God's Word. One more prerequisite. To live wisely, we need to build a life plan that is consistent with God's plan. Look over in chapter 19, Proverbs 19, verse 21. Proverbs 19, verse 21, many plans are in a man's heart, but the counsel of the Lord will stand. The wise saying, or this wise saying, presents a contrast between the many intentions, the many goals, aspirations that characterize a human heart with a single plan of God. Although we might strategize, we might scheme to accomplish our own goals, ultimately God's plan is the only plan that's going to be established. If you don't know, or if you're not sure, read the book of Jonah, right? He had his own plan. He thought, I'm going to do this scheme. I'm going to do it this way. I'm not going to do that. Ultimately, he did what God wanted him to do. The implication of this Proverbs is that we ought to try to make our plans consistent with God's plan. You all know I like to plan ahead. I like to have a wall calendar in my office of the whole year. I plan out my day. Maybe we all do. Maybe a little bit of detail, right? And then we plan for the week. We plan for the month and for the year. But as we get further out, we start to narrow our plans to be more, not so detailed, but just kind of in general. Like when the New Year's comes up, I think, what theme am I going to use for this year? What am I going to be in 2023? And you'll hear that theme interwoven throughout my lessons throughout the year, but that's in general. But ultimately, we ought to be doing, when we're planning out anything, whether it's for a day, a week, a month, and even for the years and on down for a retirement, what should be the sole focus there? God's plan. And that doesn't mean we need to throw out whatever we have planned or whatever thoughts we have. We need to make sure that whatever we do for the glory or to the glory of the Father, to God. You know, I'm a preacher, so I need to make sure that whatever I preach, all that I say is the very utterance of God. If I was still working at C.B. Richard Ellis or at State Farm or wherever it may have been, I would make sure that whatever work I did, I stayed faithful to God's word. I would not lie. I would not cheat or scheme. I would be honest in all my business dealings. When you think about success in your life, what kind of picture comes to mind? Do you picture success in our lives as the American dream, as owning your own home, having successful kids who finish college, being upwardly mobile, having lots of money, maybe retiring and getting that RV and traveling and going to Yellowstone? And you know what mine is, right? That's what I would like to do. That would be great. Nothing wrong with any of these things, But none of these things ask, what is God's plan in my world, and how can my life plan fit God's plan? I need to be ready to change things. I've had to make a lot of adjustments to what I thought life was going to be, because God had different plans for me. His plan for the world, we know, is to share the good news of his love as it's revealed through his son, Jesus. He wants that shared through all the world. And you and me, we're the ones that share that. God's plan is being part of all of us, being part of the one new church, the one new man. And for us to share that with those all around us. To live wisely, we need to redefine what we mean by success. We need to abandon the quest for self-fulfillment, which we see in our culture, abandon ourselves to Christ's fulfillment. We need to find out how God has uniquely wired us and how this uniqueness can be used for God. What is my talents? What is it that gifts God's given to me? And how can I use them for the kingdom? We need to build a life plan that's consistent with the Word. And we can't do that unless we know what that Word is. We know to live wisely, we need to establish an authentic relationship with God. We need to passionately pursue wisdom. We need to embrace an accurate moral code. And we need to build a life plan that is consistent with God's life plan for us in this life, in this world. We're not trying to please men. We're not trying to please the world. But we're striving to please God. So God is inviting us to join him on that journey in this new life. It's a journey that can't start until we've established that authentic relationship with him. So where are we? I mentioned the theme we have for this year. It is, what are we going to be in 2023? So where are we in that? How are we doing? Have we stopped to really look at what 22 was like, what we did in our lives in 2022, what we did for the church, what we did for the Lord, how we've grown in our lives? You know, one of the things we like to do is start the new year with reading through the whole Bible in 1 year, one time. Maybe do it in 6 months. You think you could do it in 6 months? Read the whole Bible in 6 months, and then in the last 6 months, do another read-through of the Bible. Or maybe this year, I'm going to strive to ask Chris if I can teach a lesson on Wednesday night. Maybe I'm going to teach a Bible class. Maybe I want to help out and sit in on the high school class and see if I can help out with that. I'm going to step out of my comfort zone, and I'm going to do my best to try to insert things of God in my conversation with those who are outside these walls, maybe at work or at school, to represent God in a better way in my life, and to look at those places where we are weak so that we can build ourselves up stronger in all aspects unto him, to look like him. That's what we ought to be striving for. But all requires wisdom. Not mine, but his. I need to know what God's thoughts are, and so I need to get into the Word. And so he's looking to you and me to get out there and be that light and be that salt. So what are we going to be? Where are we in this journey? Do we know the Lord? And if not, we ask that you do. We ask that you have that Bible study with us. Get to know the Lord. And if you know him, but you haven't put him on in baptism, be raised up to that new life, we want to offer you that invitation this morning. It's his invitation. We encourage you to take it this morning as we stand, as we sing this song of invitation.